Imagine living in a place where the ground shakes, on average, several times a day, a country that sits literally at the meeting point of 4 different tectonic plates, where cities of more than 30 million people live, generation after generation, with the absolute certainty that a major earthquake isn't some remote possibility, but simply a matter of time. And yet, that same country has built some of the tallest skyscrapers, the fastest trains, and the safest cities on the planet, precisely on land that almost anywhere else in the world would be considered uninhabitable. Today we're going to tell you the real story of how Japan learned, through tragedy, trial, and an almost unbreakable patience, to live alongside the oldest danger built into its geography. Before we continue, if you enjoy this kind of content, give the video a like and subscribe with the bell turned on so you never miss any of the journeys we have planned for you. To understand why Japan shakes so much, we first need to look at a map most people never stop to examine closely. The Japanese archipelago sits directly on what geologists call the Pacific Ring of Fire, a vast chain of faults and volcanoes that wraps almost entirely around the largest ocean on the planet. But Japan has an even more extreme feature. It's one of the few places on Earth where 4 separate tectonic plates converge at once: the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the Eurasian Plate, and the North American Plate, all pushing, sliding, and colliding beneath the same territory. This particular geological combination explains why Japan accounts for, according to various estimates, around 10% of all seismic activity recorded worldwide each year, despite the fact that its territory represents a tiny fraction of the planet's total surface area. For centuries, the people of this archipelago had no scientific explanation for so much shaking, and as often happens throughout human history, the answer came through myth. A very old legend, still known today by practically everyone in Japan, tells of an enormous mythical catfish named Namazu, said to live buried beneath the Japanese islands. It was believed that this giant fish was responsible for earthquakes whenever it stirred underground, and that only a protective god, pressing a sacred stone down on its head, managed to keep it relatively calm. Interestingly, this legend, far from generating only fear, also became a kind of cultural release valve. During the Edo period, satirical prints became popular showing the catfish being punished by an angry populace after a particularly destructive earthquake, an almost therapeutic way of collectively processing the trauma of a natural disaster no one could truly control. But beyond myths and legends, traditional Japanese architecture developed long before modern seismic engineering ever existed, extraordinarily clever solutions to the real problem. Temples and multi-story pagodas, some over 1,000 years old and still standing today, incorporated a revolutionary principle for their time: flexibility over rigidity. Rather than trying to build completely immovable structures, as was done in much of Western architecture during the same era, Japanese master carpenters designed buildings capable of moving slightly during a tremor, absorbing the energy instead of resisting it head-on. Many ancient pagodas even feature a thick central wooden column, known as a shinbashira, that isn't firmly anchored to the rest of the structure, but acts almost like an internal pendulum, swaying independently and helping counteract the whole building's oscillating motion during a quake. Modern engineers have studied this centuries-old design with genuine fascination, and several of its basic principles ended up inspiring, centuries later, some of the most advanced anti-seismic technologies in use today. However, not even centuries of accumulated wisdom could prevent Japan, at different points in its history, from suffering catastrophes of truly devastating magnitude. The first major turning point came on September 1, 1923, when an extremely powerful earthquake struck the Kanto region in the center of the country, devastating much of Tokyo and the nearby port city of Yokohama. The earthquake itself was already devastating, But what turned that day into one of the worst disasters in modern Japanese history were the massive fires that broke out immediately afterward, fueled by the coal stoves that, at that midday hour, were lit in thousands of homes in a city built largely of wood and paper. The flames spread so violently that, in some areas, they generated actual fire tornadoes, phenomena capable of wiping out entire city blocks within minutes. It's estimated that the earthquake and the subsequent fires together killed more than 100,000 people, a figure that turned that disaster into a deep national trauma, comparable only to the worst wartime episodes in the country's history. That collective trauma, however, ended up becoming the real starting point of modern Japanese seismic engineering. Just a few years after the tragedy, the country began developing its first building codes with mandatory seismic requirements, establishing for the first time specific technical standards that new buildings had to meet in order to withstand future earthquakes. It was still a modest start compared to today's standards, but it laid an essential foundation. In Japan, from that moment on, seismic safety would stop being a matter left to chance or luck and would become a state priority sustained across generations. That priority was steadily refined throughout the 20th century. But the real leap toward the engineering we associate with Japan today came through its most iconic skyscrapers. Contrary to what intuition might suggest, the solution to an earthquake isn't building increasingly rigid, massive structures, but exactly the opposite, giving them the ability to move in a controlled way. One of the best examples of this principle is Tokyo Tower and, more recently, Tokyo Skytree, the tallest self-supporting structure in all of Japan, which incorporates an internal damping system directly inspired by those ancient wooden pagodas, a central core capable of swaying independently from the rest of the building, absorbing and dissipating much of the seismic energy before it can compromise the main structure. Many modern skyscrapers built in Tokyo and other major Japanese cities today incorporate base isolation systems, using enormous rubber and steel dampers or even special bearing layers that literally allow the entire building to slide several inches from side to side during an earthquake, instead of directly transmitting that violent shaking upward floor by floor. There are even office buildings equipped with enormous suspended counterweights on their upper floors, true giant pendulums weighing several tons that automatically shift in the opposite direction of the building's motion to neutralize much of the oscillation caused by the quake. Thanks to this kind of technology, it's not at all unusual for people on the upper floors of a Japanese skyscraper to feel, at most, a slight sway during an earthquake of considerable magnitude, while the entire structure works silently to absorb energy that, without that engineering, would be catastrophic. All of this technology, however, faced its toughest test once again on March 11, 2011, when one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded by modern instruments anywhere in the world struck off Japan's northeastern coast. The quake, generated on the ocean floor, displaced such a colossal volume of water that it triggered a devastating tsunami, with waves that in some coastal areas exceeded 50 feet in height, wiping out entire towns within minutes. It's telling that the vast majority of modern buildings in the region, designed and built under strict seismic codes, withstood the shaking of the earthquake itself remarkably well. The real catastrophe came afterward, from the water, when the tsunami struck coastal areas that, despite having seawalls, weren't prepared for a wave of that magnitude. That disaster left close to 20,000 people dead or missing, and also triggered one of the most severe nuclear accidents in recent history at the Fukushima power plant, when the facility's cooling system was completely knocked out after being struck by the tsunami. The consequences of that accident forced the permanent evacuation of tens of thousands of people from their own homes, and even today, more than a decade later, certain areas near the plant remain under strict access restrictions. It was, without a doubt, one of the most painful episodes in all of contemporary Japanese history, and also one that most accelerated, in the years that followed, a deep review of both seismic and nuclear safety protocols across the entire country. From that tragedy came lessons that Japan incorporated with remarkable speed and discipline. The National Earthquake Early Warning System, which already existed before 2011, was refined even further. Today it's capable of detecting the first seismic waves, generally less destructive, and automatically sending alerts to cell phones, trains, and industrial systems, mere seconds before the truly dangerous waves arrive. Those seconds, which at first glance might seem insignificant, prove in practice to be enough for bullet trains to automatically slow down, for factory production lines to shut down preventively, and for millions of people to take cover under a table or move away from objects that might fall in a matter of decisive instants. Just as important as all this technology has been the building, over generations, of a genuine social culture of constant preparedness in the face of disaster. From a very young age, Japanese children regularly take part in earthquake and evacuation drills at their own schools, learning basic protection protocols almost automatically from an early age. Most Japanese households keep an emergency backpack prepared in advance, with water, non-perishable food, flashlights, and radios ready to be used within seconds in case of any emergency. In practically every train station, shopping center, and public building across the country, there are clearly marked meeting points and evacuation routes, an invisible infrastructure in daily life, but one that activates immediately the moment it's needed. This culture of preparedness isn't limited to earthquakes alone. It also extends to the specific threat of tsunamis. Along much of Japan's coastline exposed to the Pacific Ocean, tall seawalls have been built, along with vertical evacuation towers specifically designed for low-lying areas, where there simply isn't enough time to flee inland before a wave arrives. In some coastal regions, centuries-old tsunami memorial stones are also preserved, genuine stone warnings placed by earlier generations, marking with total precision exactly how far the water reached in a past disaster, frequently accompanied by the same recommendation carved into the rock: do not build homes below this exact point. It's deeply telling that, in 2011, some of the few communities that actually heeded those centuries-old warnings turned out to also be among those that suffered the fewest human and material losses during the tsunami. Beyond buildings and warning systems, Japan has also developed a transportation infrastructure that, despite operating under constant seismic risk, maintains levels of safety and punctuality truly astonishing by any international standard. The famous bullet train, known as the Shinkansen, has carried billions of passengers over more than half a century of operation, and to date has not recorded in its entire history a single passenger fatality attributable directly to a derailment caused by an earthquake, a result largely explained by its sophisticated early seismic detection system, capable of automatically stopping trains in motion within seconds of detecting the first signs of an earthquake of a certain magnitude. This combination of technology, social discipline, and historical memory has made Tokyo a truly unique case within the global urban landscape, one of the largest metropolitan areas on the planet, with more than 30 million residents in its greater area, and at the same time, according to numerous international comparative studies, one of the safest cities in the world against natural disasters, despite sitting literally in one of the most seismically active zones on the entire planet. Japanese seismologists themselves keep repeating, however, a constant warning: the question isn't whether a new major earthquake will strike the Tokyo region, but simply when it will happen. Official Japanese government estimates calculate a considerably high probability of a major earthquake striking the Tokyo metropolitan area within the coming decades, and precisely because of that statistical certainty, the entire city continues preparing constantly, reinforcing older buildings, periodically updating its emergency protocols, and educating each new generation under the same fundamental premise that has guided the country over the past century. The earthquake is inevitable, but human disaster, to a certain extent, can be prevented with sufficient preparation. This philosophy of living alongside risk, rather than a naive denial of danger, is also reflected in much more subtle, everyday ways throughout Japanese life. Many restaurants and cafes across the country carefully secure their shelves and dishware to the walls using special anchors. Pharmacies keep easily accessible basic first aid supplies on hand, and even household gas systems include automatic shutoff valves that activate immediately upon detecting the slightest significant seismic vibration, cutting off the supply preventively to avoid fires after a tremor, a historic problem that, as we saw, had already proven devastating back in 1923 during the Great Kanto earthquake. In the end, Japan has turned its own turbulent geology into one of its greatest national strengths, never eliminating the very real risk of living on one of the most unstable regions on the planet, something that's simply impossible to achieve, but learning to anticipate it, mitigate it, and survive it generation after generation, with a consistency and discipline very few countries in the world have managed to match. Every skyscraper that gently sways during a tremor, every bullet train that automatically brakes within seconds, and every child who calmly practices a school evacuation drill are all part of the same collective response that an entire people has been building, patiently and meticulously, over more than a full century of history. If you made it this far, you now know the real story behind Japanese resilience far better than the vast majority of people who only associate this country with technology or pop culture. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like, subscribe with the bell turned on, and tell us in the comments what surprised you the most about this entire story. See you on the next journey.